Don't forget that shaking is required. Most of you have heard the analogy or the story about the professor and the jar in the classroom, where he came out and then put this jar on the table, and then he put on the table a pile of rocks, a pile of pebbles, and another separate jar of sand, and he also had a pitcher of water. And he said to the class, he took the rocks and put them in the jar and said, "Is the jar full?" And they said, "Yes." But then he put in some of the pebbles and poured them in and shook the jar. That part is often missed. He shook the jar to help make adjustments, and the pebbles found the open spaces. And then he says, "Is the jar full now?" The students were catching on, but said yes, but they knew there was a trick question here. So then he took the sand and poured it into the jar, and again shook the jar so that the sand could settle into the empty spaces. And then he said, "Is the jar full?" Now believing it was, he then took the pitcher of water and poured some water in. Now, the water in the jar didn't need to be shaken because water goes to the empty spaces naturally. But the sand and the pebbles needed to be shaken to find those open spaces. So that's what I want to add on to this analogy or story today. One most of us know, but we often forget that shaking is required in order to figure out where our varying priorities fit. Now, the analogy usually says that the rocks are the most important thing, the pebbles are next to most important, the sand is the small stuff, and the water is perhaps arguably even smaller stuff. I don't like that analogy because the point is, yes, there are rocks that are the bigger thing, but many times our perspective is that everything is a rock. Some people will say, the problem is not that I don't understand the pebbles, the sand, and the water, but I've got all these big rocks and they're overflowing the jar. And what I would argue is this is where we need to shake up our perspective and consider that perhaps not all of the rocks are the highest priority. I have made them the highest priority. And that's what happens to my jar. Because now I certainly can add more pebbles and maybe I can create space for them. But I'm so stressed out about not being able to handle all the rocks or priorities. So, yes, in order to create and find that extra space, we need to shake things up. A lot of that is shaking up our perspectives and certainly our thinking. And in this case, our priorities or the way we prioritize. We all know that if everything's important, we're not going to get to important things. And I would challenge you by saying if your life is truly too filled, overfilled with top priorities, something has to change. It's not only not sustainable, it's not even achievable. The jar and the rocks tell us that. There are limits to top priorities. And I would tell you that more often than not, for me, and I would suggest for you, the problem is not too many top priorities. The problem is I have made too many things top priorities. And top priorities means that top, three letters, those biggies. And maybe they're not all biggies to in the grand scheme of a year, but today, what are the priorities? Because not everything is a top priority today. That perhaps an unsolvable solution. So we need to do some shaking to help all those priorities find their place in our lives. And just make sure that several of those big rocks in that jar are about your self-care. We all know that truth, but most of us, including me, many days, are not living that way. I've been changing my priorities. I've got a ways to go. But my jar and those big rocks include taking care of me every day.